Hey everyone, so when you think about modern American warfare, what comes to mind? Probably high-tech drones, right? Stealth bombers, precision strikes. This idea of a clean, hands-off war fought from miles away. But what if I told you that in a real major conflict against a serious competitor, all of that gets flipped on its head? What if it actually forces the US back to old-school, boots-on-the-ground fighting? Today, we're going to unpack a really fascinating strategic theory that does just that.
So, this is really the core question we're tackling. In a long, drawn out, serious war, would the United States actually commit to a massive ground campaign? The source material we're digging into today makes a pretty bold claim. It argues that the answer is not only yes, but that other countries might be actively trying to make that exact scenario happen.
All right, so here's our roadmap. First, we're going to break down a really important military theory called the cost pyramid. Then, we'll see how that theory gets applied in a super complex four-player geopolitical game. After that, we'll see how this could all lead to a ground war. And finally, we have to tackle the big one. Why not just use nuclear weapons? Okay, first things first. We have to get our heads around this core concept because everything else builds on it. It's called the military cost pyramid, and it's all about how a country can or can't sustain a long, grinding war of attrition. Now, don't just think about the sticker price of a fighter jet. The cost pyramid is really about something deeper: production. How much time, how much energy, how many resources does it take to replace what you lose in a fight? A healthy military, one that's built to last in a long war, needs a really wide, stable base of stuff that's cheap and easy to replace. And this is where it gets really interesting. Look at the contrast here. A standard sustainable pyramid has infantry, soldiers, at the very bottom. Why? Because, to put it bluntly, they are the cheapest and fastest asset to produce. At the very top, the peak, you have air power, incredibly expensive, takes forever to replace. But the source we're looking at argues the US military has literally flipped this upside down. It's an inverted pyramid that depends on its most expensive, hardest to replace assets. You just can't win a war of attrition that way. You're going to run out of jets way before the other side runs out of soldiers. Now you might be thinking, hang on, this inverted pyramid seemed to work just fine in places like Iraq or during the Gulf War. And that's a fair point. But the source makes a really critical distinction here. It says those weren't real wars, not in the sense of a grinding attrition battle against a peer competitor. The technological gap was so huge, it was, and I'm quoting here, basically a video game. A war with a country like Iran, for example, would be a whole different ballgame. So, with that pyramid theory locked in our minds, let's see how it applies to a really complex scenario laid out in the source material. Think of it as a four-player chess match in the Middle East, where nobody's true objectives are what they seem on the surface. Okay, this table from the source lays out some pretty shocking goals. I mean, look at this. The US objective seems straightforward enough. Take out Iran to control the region. But then look at the others. Iran? Okay, they want to destroy the US military presence there, which is CENTCOM. But then we get to the really wild part. The source claims that America's own allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia, have goals that actually include getting rid of US influence in the region so that they can be the top dogs. And this quote just hammers the point home. This isn't some small disagreement over tactics. The source is arguing that the fundamental long-term strategic goals of the United States and its most important allies in the region are in direct opposition. And understanding this conflict of interest is absolutely key to understanding what could happen next. So, if these other players, including supposed allies, actually want to see US power in the region gone, how could they possibly pull that off? Well, according to this analysis, they don't have to beat the US military in a straight-up fight. They just have to be clever enough to manipulate the US into fighting the absolute worst kind of war for its structure. And here is the strategic logic laid out step by step. The real goal isn't a military victory on the battlefield. It's to break the American political will to even be there. And how do you do that? You drag the war out. Make it a long, bloody battle of attrition. This pokes directly at the weak spot we talked about, that inverted pyramid. Eventually, you force the US to send in ground troops, the one thing its pyramid isn't set up to sustain, and you just bleed the US of its resources, its money, and its will to keep fighting. So, this is the vulnerability at the heart of the problem. The source describes the US strategy as passive. It says there's no clear, coherent goal beyond this general idea to destroy Iran. And this vagueness, this passivity, is what leaves the door wide open for other players who know exactly what they want to come in and strategically manipulate the situation to their advantage. Right about now, there's a huge question that's probably on your mind.
If things really get that bad, why wouldn't the US just play its ultimate trump card? Nuclear weapons? Well, if we follow the strategic logic we've been talking about, it's really not that simple.
First off, using nukes would end the war way too fast. And if the whole goal of your enemies is to bleed you dry in a long, drawn-out conflict, a quick ending is the last thing they want. But it goes way beyond that. You have massive internal pressures. Any leader has to worry about political will at home, what the rest of the world thinks, and the morale of their own troops. I mean, it's hard to convince your soldiers they're fighting a just war after you go nuclear. And of course, there's the huge risk of things spiraling completely out of control.
So here's the bottom line. A real war, according to this line of thinking, is so much more complicated than just having the fanciest technology. It's about your capacity to produce, it's about managing your resources, and maybe most importantly, it's about controlling the political story. In this view, a country with a sustainable military structure and a really clever strategy can actually beat a technologically superior enemy just by outlasting them and breaking their will to fight.
And all of this leaves us with one final and pretty heavy question that the source material raises. We've talked about the how, the mechanics of how a ground war could be forced. But this gets to the why. Why would any nation, the United States or anyone else, be willing to risk its entire system, its economy, its people, its political stability, all for the prize of controlling one region of the world? That's a huge question, and there's no easy answer. Something to think about.